It's okay. Off the mic, it's okay. Off the mic,
Chai! Now wow, people wey supposed talk truth to power don't off mic. And if we talk, now 500,000 they go summer us, call them hate speech. But fear not, Maiyegun don't come. Him go torchlight every corner, nooks and cranny of all these bad people where they spoil our country. So my people make we loud, oh, yo. Maiyegun don't come, oh, yo. My people make we shout, oh, yo. Maiyegun don't come, oh, yo. Maiyegun don't come, man of the masses, oh, yo. Maiyegun don't come, oh, yo. Maiyegun diary politico, yo. Maiyegun don't come, oh, yo. This one not the off in mind, oh, yo. Maiyegun don't come, oh, yo. And in the touchlight every corner, oh, yo. Maiyegun don't come, oh, yo. Okay, some people be they holla say they want the power. Chai, them be promise us say we go get light and power. Nah. Them hustle sote they can't get the power. But now they know they do anything with the power. Every day, dollar just they get the higher power over naira. Still them talk say make we off mind. But thank God say Maiyegun don't come. So my people make you loud, oh, yo. Maiyegun don't come, oh, yo. My people make we shout, oh, yo. Maiyegun don't come, oh, yo. Maiyegun don't come, man of the masses, oh, yo. Maiyegun don't come, oh, yo. Maiyegun diary politico, oh, yo. Maiyegun don't come, oh, yo. This one not they off in mind, oh, yo. Maiyegun don't come, oh, yo. Person where they do evil, no one make person talk. Them say that Maiyegun, that man too they talk. He too they talk. Say Maiyegun diary, he they hot like pepper. But every day then they take money in bulk. Woman picking, they the street they hawk. Still them talk say make we no talk. But thank God say Maiyegun don't come. So my people make you loud, oh, yo. Maiyegun don't come, oh, yo. My people make you shout, oh, yo. Maiyegun don't come, oh, yo. Maiyegun don't come, man of the masses, oh, yo. Maiyegun don't come, oh, yo. Maiyegun diary politico, oh, yo. Maiyegun don't come, oh, yo. This man not they off in mind, oh, yo. Maiyegun don't come.
Hello there. So good afternoon to you, or maybe good morning to you, or good evening to you, from wherever you are joining us this afternoon. So it's brunch time with Maiyegun. So we started reading the Flora forgotten books among them, right? And it is called a tropical dependency. It's one lovely history, sort of like packed in one piece of book. So we started yesterday, says an outline of the ancient history of the Western Sudan with an account of the modern settlement of northern Nigeria. So that's what we're reading. So if you by any chance come across this video, so the most you can do is share the video, okay? And you can listen to it like you are listening to, like this audio mark podcast. So if you started with us yesterday, and if you didn't, it's okay. You can always catch up. If you have a copy of the book yourself, you can read along. But if you have other things doing, especially if this is your own money, then maybe you should just listen. You can put it on in your car, in the office, in your headpiece and all that. And you can listen as you desire. So give me 1 sec. I need to get something to wipe my face. So I'll be back in a minute or two. Shall not go anywhere. Okay, come in. So for the next 2 hours, I am going to be reading from this book, and you can listen, sit there, engage with it, or just listen on the side if that's what works for you, okay? But we shall know how we do it. It is brunch time, and of course, you can still be part of it. So I am going to continue from chapter 3. Yeah, and the book is A Tropical Dependency. You see that, right? One moment. Right. So thank you so much for joining me, if you have. And yeah, let's continue. Let's continue. So last time we were on how the Arabs took over the North Africa, and then from there they pushed their adventure right into Spain, and they actually captured part of Spain, because I don't think it's everything they captured, but it says Arab civilization in Spain. That is our chapter 3, page 31. The fascinating story of the conquest of Spain by the Arabs and of the development of a civilization far in advance of anything known at the time to Western Europe lies outside the scope of this book. Yet the history of Negroland and of Spain were in their early days so closely interwoven through the links of the Arab and Berber connection that the records of Arab civilization are not altogether foreign to the history of West Africa. The conquest book placed at the beginning of the 8th century and was for all ordinary purposes complete. It was carried out almost entirely by Berber troops, whom Musa continued to convert, to organize, and to draft into Spain. Tangiers, which had always been a Berber stronghold, became for this purpose its military headquarters, and he was enabled perpetually to recruit his conquering armies with fresh troops. Tariq took 12,000 of these converts with him on his first landing. There was a tradition lingering from the Greek population, from the Greek occupation of the country, that Spain would be conquered only by 2 nations composed of peoples unaccustomed to the luxuries of life, added by deprivation and fatigue. The Arabs and the Andalusians alike translated the prophecy to apply to the Arabs and the Berbers for a long period, says one of their historians. The Berbers and Andalusians had hated each other across the straits. For Berbers, being more in want of Andalusians than these were of them, than they were of them, rather, owing to certain necessaries not to be procured in Africa, which were imported from Andalus. Communication necessarily existed between the people of both countries. The Berbers had long wanted Spain. Spain had long feared the Berbers. The conquest of Spain was therefore to some extent regarded as a fulfillment of the destiny of both nations. But while the Berbers claimed to be of the same stock as the Arabs, and were admitted, as has been seen, to some degree of comradeship, they were at a very inferior stage of civilization. The sense of difference of the cultivated Arabs was expressed by a comic poet who suffered under a subsequent Berber dynasty for his readiness of speech. in quote, I saw Adam in my dream. He makes one of his characters declare. And I said to him, oh, father of mankind, men gradually, sorry, one sec. Sorry, it's roasting right now. It is roasting right now in Glasgow, by the way. So my entire office is like, even though the windows are opened, my entire office is like a bakery, you know, when I walked in. So I hope it gets better so that I won't have to be sweating like a Christmas goat in here, you know. Anyway, let's continue. Let's continue our reading. Okay. Said, O father of mankind, men generally agree that the Barbars are descended from thee. Yes, replied Adam. It is true, but none dispute that Eve was at that time divorced from me. Brothers, but brothers of divorce very fairly represent the relation which for a long time existed between Berber and Arab. Shortly after the whole of Spain was reduced, there was a general Arab migration to it. And it was with this Arab migration that the high civilization came. For about 50 years, the Berbers, in fitful revolution, struggled against the Arabs for the sole possession of a country which they claimed that they alone had won. The conflict between the dynasties of the Umayyads and the Abbasides in the east gave opportunities for the disaffected in Spain. But about the middle of the 8th century, when the Abbasides succeeded in overthrowing the dynasty of the Umayyads in the east and possessing themselves of the caliphate, one son of the Umayyads escaped into North Africa and after many adventures established himself under the name of Abdurrahman I upon the throne of his fathers in Spain. He ascended the throne in 757 AD, thus separating the Caliphate of the East from the Caliphate of the West, and brilliantly opened the chapter of cultivated Arab rule in the West. The dynasty of the Umayyads lasted in Spain for upward of 250 years and may be thought of as coming to an end in power at least about the year 1000 AD. When after an interval of misrule, it was succeeded in the latter part of the 11th century, that is shortly after the Norman conquest of England by the purely Berber dynasty of the Almoravids. During the first 2 centuries of the rule of the Umayyads, the Arab dominion in Spain reached its highest point. The court of Abdurrahman and his successors became the center of all the arts, the learning, the refinement, and the elegance of the known world. Commerce brought to the shores of Spain the best productions of every land. Science was honored. Arab travelers penetrated to the furthest limits of the Eastern Hemisphere. All that India and China had to teach us was known to them. They had a common saying that science came down from heaven and lodged itself in 3 different parts of man's body: in the brain among the Greeks, in the arms among the Chinese, and in the tongue among the Arabs. Unfortunate in the fate that subsequently befell them, the Arabs were fortunate in this, that during the period of their prosperity, they had historians and poets capable of preserving for posterity records of the high level of civilization that was reached. Religious fanaticism, which made a duty at a later period of sweeping the infidel out of Spain, made it no less a matter of conscience to destroy the admirable literature which centuries of enlightenment had amassed in the libraries of his forefathers. Fortunately, However, the writings were so copious that many escaped destruction, and the industry of modern research has brought again to light learning which was indignantly rejected by the religious Europe of the Middle Ages. To appreciate in any degree the depth which Europe holds to the Arab civilization of Spain, we have to remember the conditions of the barbarous ignorance, sloth, and superstitious in which the continent was plunged after the breakup of the Roman Empire. What the Barbar was to North Africa, such was the Scythian or Scythian in the many divisions of Gauls, Huns, and seas to Europe. What the cultivated northern strip lying between the mountains and the sea was to North Africa, such on the continent of Europe was the strip lying also between the mountains and the sea, which is known to us under the names of Italy, Spain, and Greece. To both these famous districts, the Mediterranean had given life and the mountains defense. Beyond the mountains, equally on the north and on the south, countless hordes of nomads are unacquainted with the gentler art of civilization, but vigorous and active in their barbarism, awaited nothing but the opportunity of conquest. The Scythians and the Barbars were in their original condition pastoral tribes of migratory habits, feeding exclusively on meat and milk, and clothing themselves in the skins of animals. Of many of them, it is said that they had never even seen bread. This as well on the plains of Europe and Asia, as in the African deserts. They had no dwelling houses and no domestic arts. Leather tents or straw huts served all their temporary purpose, but they were hardy, abstemious, expert riders, brave, brutal, and proficient in all the ruder military virtues. Nothing strikes the student of Berber history more than the resemblance to be noted between the characteristics of the Berber tribes and the descriptive traits recorded by Tacitus, and quoted by Gibbon from early authors of the primitive inhabitants of Northern Europe. The cannibalism which distinguished the extreme barbarism of Africa was not wanting, as we know, among the aboriginals of northern Germany. In Europe, the decadence of Rome and the downfall of Byzantine Empire gave opportunity for the northern tribes to possess themselves of all the outlying territories of the empire. And from the first wedlock of decadence and barbarism, the states of modern Europe took their rise. In Africa, the strong intellectual impulse of the Jews and Saracens dominated the brute forces of barbarism by which it was surrounded, and the southern tribes, instead of conquering, became the instrument of conquest, directed by a higher mind. While Europe fell to the level of our conquerors, Arabian civilization rose, and spreading through Africa to Spain, it maintained for the Western world the moral ideals and the intellectual enlightenment which, without the refuge afforded them in Spain, had perhaps been wholly lost. Medieval Arabian achievements in the higher path of learning are well known. There is no branch of scientific development among the Western nations upon which the Arabs have not set their mark, either by original research or by the service which they rendered in transmitting to their European posterity the learning accumulated by other generations in other lands. They initiated the Renaissance in Europe by preserving and translating at a much earlier period the great works of the Greeks. They gave a vivifying impulse to all the intellectual life of the West by introducing to it the hoarded knowledge of the East. In mathematics, they imported much from India, amongst other things, the numerals known to us as Arabic numerals, and with them, the advantages of the decimal system. The word cipher, with all its derivations, is an Arabic word. They translated from the Greek Euclid and the earlier geometers, but it was to the original studies of an Arab geometer, Ben Musa, of the 9th century, that Europe owed its use of the improved science, to which the Arabs gave its modern name of algebra. Ben Musa was the inventor of the common method of solving quadratic equations, as well as of the substitution of signs for chords in trigonometry. His system was the system commonly adopted by the Arab schools. The Arabs were ardent students of mathematics, and a long list of astronomers and physicists from Al-Maimon, who determined the obliquity of the ecliptic in 830 AD, through Ibn Junis, who constructed the Achaemite tables of the stars in 1008. Avicenna, the well-known physician and philosopher, who wrote, amongst other things, in the early part of the 11th century, an encyclopedia of human knowledge in 20 volumes. Al-Ghazali, who in 1058 was the forerunner of Descartes. Al-Azim, the optician, who established the modern theory of vision, basing it on clear anatomical and geometrical evidence, and who was the first to trace, about the year 1100, the curvilinear path of rays of light through the air, deducing from his theory of refraction a determination of the height of the atmosphere, to El-Idrisi, the geographer of Roger of Sicily, the famous Averroes, the commentator of Aristotle, who lived at the end of the 12th century, and the brilliant schools of medicine and surgery which adorned the 13th century, all serve to demonstrate that in the application of the abstract principle of science to natural phenomena, the Arabs luminously opened the path of modern progress. Their studies in chemistry were profound. Geber or Jaja, who lived in the 9th century and of whom Roger Bacon speaks at a much later period as the Magister Magistrorum of chemical science, was the first to describe nitric acid and aqua regia. Before him, chemistry had no stronger acid than concentrated vinegar. The properties and preparations of sulfuric acid and phosphorus soon followed. For the composition of gunpowder, we get towards the end of 8th century the following prescriptions: pulverize on a marble mortar 1 pound of sulfur, 2 of charcoal, and 6 of saltpeter. Anyone who may have visited the Royal Gunpowder Works at Waltham Abbey we know how little the prescription has altered, except in varying proportions to the present day. In geology, also, Arabian investigations were on the sound path of reason. Avicenna says of mountains that they may be due to 2 different causes. Either they are the effect of upheavals of the crust of the earth, or they are the effect of water which, cutting through itself a new route, has denuded the valleys, the strata being of different kinds, some soft, some hard. The Arabs were early acquainted with the properties of the magnets and the theory of gravitation. True conceptions of geology and astronomy led naturally to truer conceptions of the age of the earth and the lapse of historic time than have ever prevailed before the scientific era of the present day. History and geography were no less brilliantly represented than the natural sciences. Ibn Said, who wrote in the middle of the 13th century, has preserved for us a vivid description of the attainment of the Arabs of Spain. There is no department of science or literature in which it does not claim preeminence for them, and supports its claim by a list of names, strange now to the European here. But if we may judge by the manner in which they are introduced, familiar enough to the learned of his time, Ibn Said himself is described by his successors as the truthful historian. He was the descendant of a line of distinguished men and tells us that the history of Andalusia, which he carried down to the year 1247, had taken no less than 125 years to write and 6 authors to complete it. It was conceived and carried to a certain stage by his great-grandfather. It was taken further by his grandfather. His 2 great uncles worked upon it. Then came my father, Musa, who certainly was the most learned and experienced of all my ancestors in these matters. Finally, Ibn Said himself completed the work. It is said that a better history of Andalusia was never written. Andalusia is Spain, by the way, just so you know. Spain is Andalusia. Arabs, right, that, conquered the Barbars, the Tangiers, the Barbars, the Tripolians, and what have you, right? As far back as, 623 AD, 620s, all right? Now we are in the 2000s now, right? 2025. Now this is like going back to 1,000 years ago. I mean, if we have to compare notes now, okay? Because this one says, just about 1,000 years ago, when it was all about killed or be killed to survive in that world. Then, the weak would have to be exterminated, taken over as slaves. Some of them sold, their lands taken, and that's what happened. You see, Ben Musa or Ibn Musa, the guy, an Arab that conquered, places like Libya, Morocco, Egypt, right? Acquired so many slaves, put it that way. Some of them, he freed them and turned them into his army. So because Morocco and Spain, now water separates them. So he built ships, right? And then transported all his fighters and moved them straight to Spain. And then, Spain is called then Andalusia also. So they conquered Spain, introduced Arab way of life, science, name it. And the historian said that lasted for more than 250 years. Can you believe that? I mean, we heard about the Spanish Amanda. You know Spanish Amanda? Spanish Amanda was the number of ships that Spain actually built. And they also went to Africa too to take slaves. Meanwhile, they were once slaves too, enslaved by the Arabs. See the history? Well, everything is still coming down to northern Nigeria, by the way, but this is just like the Jara, Anyway, thanks so much for joining me, though. Share the broadcast if you haven't already. Now let's continue. History and geography were no less brilliantly represented. Oh, sorry, I think I've covered that already. Yeah, let's go forward a bit. Okay. Writing, okay. Right, I'll take it from this side then, all right. It is said that a better history of Andalusia was never written. Contemporary with the earlier parts of this composition was the geography of El Idrisi, who wrote about the year 1153. Nearly the whole of this work is still extant. For the purpose of contrasting the state of knowledge of Arabic Spain with the ignorance of the Christian countries of the north, who had yet to wait nearly 400 years for a true knowledge of the conformation of the earth, the following passage from it may be quoted. In quote, "What results from the opinion of philosophers, learned men, and those skilled in observation of the heavenly bodies is that the world is round as a sphere, of which the water are adherent and maintained upon its surface by natural equilibrium. It is surrounded by air, and all created bodies are stable on its surface. The earth drawing to itself all that is heavy in the same way as a magnet attracts iron. The terrestrial globe is divided into two equal parts by the equinoctial or noctial line. The circumference of the earth is divided into 360 degrees, each of 25 parasangs. This is the Indian calculation. From the equinoctial line, is that even the word? I'm going to find out how to pronounce that. Sorry, guys. Equinoctial. So how do you pronounce that? Pronounce.
Equinoctial.
Equinoctial. It's called equinoctial.
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 Equinoctial. And what's the meaning? Relating to an equinox, or to a state, or the time of equal day and night. Equinoctial. Okay, equinoctial. Right. That's something. Anyway. So, the earth, it says elsewhere, is essentially round, but not of a perfect rotundity, being somewhat depressed at the poles. His description of the countries upon the earth, including England to the west and China to the east, is extraordinarily full, and in many essential particulars remains accurate to the present day. America alone appears to have been unknown to the Arabs, and when we remember that modern Europe had to wait for the journey of Magellan round the world in the opening years of 16th century to be quite sure of the shape of the globe, he must admit that in the learning of the Arabs of Spain, Negroland had sources of information far purer than any of which England at that time could boast. Again, the mention of civilization in Negroland. Negroland is the black part of Africa, by the way, you know. So what we had, England couldn't even boast of them. Like, what the heck, man? Anyway, in every branch of science, the theoretic conquest of the Arabs gave practical results. Spectacles and telescopes resulted from their study of optics. Ibn Junis, the astronomer, was the first to apply the pendulum about the year 1000 to the measure of time, and from his abstruse studies in astronomy, clocks became a domestic possession. The use of the astrolabe and the compass, revived again at a later period in Europe, were common to Arab navigation. Gunpowder has already been mentioned as a result of chemistry, and military science was revolutionized by the introduction of artillery and firearms, improvement in agriculture, and the introduction and acclimatization of new plants were an even more important result of the same study, combined with that of botany, to which the Arabs were passionately addicted. Studies in the effects of the drugs and the nature of plants were the basis of their medicine, while philosophy or physiology and anatomy gave to their surgical schools the wide renown which they enjoyed. For 7 centuries, the medical schools of Europe owed everything they knew to Arabian research. The Arabic impression is still to be traced in the derivation of such words as syrup, julep, etc. Vivisection, as well as dissection of dead bodies, was practiced in their anatomical schools, and women as well as men were trained to perform some of the most delicate surgical operations. Their studies of the functions of the human body and the cure of its diseases enabled them to establish hygienic systems, which were perhaps among the greatest of the many boons which they conferred upon medieval Europe. Every court and household of importance had at one time a Jewish or Saracen physician. Amongst other very eminent names may be quoted for surgery. You have Albucasis of Cordova, and for medicine, Ibn Zor. Ibn Zor, more generally known as Avenzoar, was regarded as the great authority in Moorish pharmacy. He lived in the first half of the 12th century and was contemporary of another and almost equally eminent physician, Al-Far. A story is told of these two, which is not without application to the dietetic. And it really worked, the wordplay in this book is quite like interesting, rather, like it's really, really interesting, knowing that something like this was put together like over 100 years ago. Like somebody put this together. That's Flora Shaw, your mama for Nigeria, the woman that named you Nigeria, by the way. So she wrote this. Okay. But let's continue. It says, Ibn Zor was very fond of green figs and ate them freely. Al-Far never ate them. And he used to say to Ibn Zor, if you eat figs to that extent, you will have a very bad abscess. Ibn Zor replied, if you don't eat them, you will be subject to fever and die of constipation. Ibn Zor was right. Al-Far had fever and died of constipation. But Al-Far was also right. Shortly after Al-Far's death, Ibn was attacked by a bad abscess and died of it in Seville in 1161. The daughter and granddaughter of this Ibn Zor were both accomplished female doctors. Avampes was another physician of the 12th century whose reputation was European. Averroes, also deeply versed in medicine, was a personal friend of Ibn Zor. In the higher department of jurisprudence and political economy, as well as in the literary fields of grammar, logic, poetry, and biography, the Arabian schools excelled. Their schools, colleges, and universities were the result of the learned of all nations. It was perhaps especially in the material development of their civilization that their prosperity had its most direct effect in stimulating commercial intercourse with Negroland. An Arab historian writing in the 16th century says of Cordova, where Abdurrahman I established his court, one thing is certain, namely that trade and agriculture flourished in this place during the reigns of sons of Omeya in a degree which was scarcely been witnessed in any city of the world. Its market was always overstocked with the fruits of the land, the productions of every district, and the best of every country. No robe, however costly, no drug, however scarce, no jewel, however precious, no rarity of distant and unknown lands was to be procured in the bazaar of Cordova, and found hundreds of purchasers. There were 471 mosques and 300 public baths, of which the numbers afterwards increased. One trustworthy writer counted the number of houses under the Caliph al-Mansur and found 63,000. That's interesting. Houses then, right? Of the great and noble, and 200,077 of the common people. There were at the same time upward 80,000 shops. Water from the mountains was conveyed to the royal palace of Cordova, and thence distributed through every corner and quarter of the city by means of leading pipes into basins of different shapes, made of the purest gold, the finest silver, or plated brass, as well as into vast lakes, curious times, amazing reservoirs, and fountains of Grecian marble beautifully carved. The town in the time of the Omeyyads measured 24 miles by 6, the greater part of which area was covered by mosques, palaces, and the houses of the great standing in beautiful gardens. These houses were palaces of luxury, magnificently decorated, cooled in summer by ingeniously arranged draughts of fresh air drawn from the garden over beds of flowers chosen for their perfume, warm in winter by hot air conveyed through pipes, with hot and cold water. There were boudoirs, drawing windows of clear and colored glass, clusters of columns of marble, either plain or encrusted with more precious substances, supported roofs of mosaic and gold. The walls were decorated with mosaics or covered with Arab precious and varied description. It was made of sandal and citron and other woods brought from the tropics, and curiously inlaid with mother of pearl, ivory, silver, and gold. There were tables of gold set with emeralds, rubies, and pearls. In winter, the walls were hung with tapestry. The floors were covered with thick Persian carpets, of which the most magnificent were embroidered with gold and pearls. There were luxurious couches piled with pillows, vases of porcelain and crystal were filled with flowers. Rare and curious objects from all parts of the world were brought together to satisfy the eye and taste. In the evening, the rooms were lit by wax candles, which were distributed by groups of hundreds in chandeliers that hung from the ceilings. Great skills and tastes were devoted to the design and workmanship of these chandeliers. They were often made from the metal found in the bells of Christian churches, and when this was the case, there seems to have been a special pleasure in designing them for use in the mosques. One famous chandelier is mentioned, which held no less than 1,804 candles. The gardens in which the great houses stood are described by every writer in terms of rapture. Bowers of roses, orange and groves, shaded walks over which lemon trees were trained, so that the fruits, when ripe, hung down like little lamps. Successions of color and perfume, to procure which plants were brought from all parts of the world. Sometimes, to please a favorite wife, a whole hillside would be planted with her choosing color. Use of water was thoroughly understood. Fountains, cascades, and lakes gave coolness and moisture to the air, and also provided opportunities for the keeping of fish and the special cultivation of water plants. Garden fruits and vegetables were cultivated in rare perfection and variety. In the gardens, there were labyrinth and marble playing courts. There were menageries of curious animals and aviaries of foreign birds. Botany, horticulture, zoology, and ornithology were passions, no less, of the learned than of the rich. In the town of Cordova, for a distance of 10 miles, the streets were lit at night by lamps placed close to one another. The descriptions of the mosques and buildings of Cordova included the famous mosque with the 360 arches, and the even more famous palace of Azara, which took 40 years to build and contained the hall of the caliphs, rooted in pure gold and lighted at will by fountains of quicksilver, which, when they were set in motion, caused the room to look in an instant as if it were traversed by flashes of lightning, and so elaborate as to fill many volumes. The size of the Azara Palace may be imagined from the fact that it had 15,000 doors. It had amongst its many beauties remarkable fountains and terraces of polished marbles, which overhung matchless garden. Anyway, they're describing their life here. So I'm going to jump to another paragraph, describing their luxury, describing their lifestyle, describing how they actually lived at the time. So, hey, let's go to another paragraph. Seville, with its famous gardens, its noble squares, its great observatory, its suspension bridge, was regarded as one of the most important Arab towns. Seville, rather. Granada was the Damascus of Andalusia, very famous under the Almohad sultans. About Spain used to have sultans too. Malaga, with its numerous towers, had the advantages of land and sea. It was famous very early in its history for the manufacture of forbidden wine. Its oil and its figs were known all over the world. So were its silks, especially the brocades, for which it had beautiful designs. Its export trade extended to India and China. Almeria was another of the rich coast towns. It had a dockyard in which very fine vessels were built. It was, according to an Arab author, Shakandi, in quote, the greatest mart in Andalusia. Christians of all nations came to his port to buy and sell, and they had factories established in it where they loaded their vessels with such goods as they wanted, owing to which, and to his being a very opulent and large city, filled with passengers and merchants, the produce of the tithe imposed upon the crews and paid by the Christian merchants amounted to very considerable sums and exceeded that collected in any other seaport. No. Right, another paragraph. Let's jump on this niceties also. So they're describing all the towns that the Arabs took in Andalusia, in Spain, right? In from 625 or so AD. Among the vegetables, hang on, before we talk vegetables, so I know it'll be like Tifnumbu vegetables, kind of. Now let's take this second, right? It says, all the towns of the Arabs had public gardens planted with groves of fine orange. This one is called a pomegranate that's a pomegranate and other trees, of which the remains are still to be seen in the Alamedas, Alamedas of southern Spain. Abdurrahman I was passionately fond of flowers. He planted beautiful gardens, to which he brought all kinds of rare and exotic plants and pine trees from foreign countries. He introduced good systems of irrigation. His passion for flowers and plants led him to send agents to Syria, India, and other countries with a commission to procure him all sorts of seeds and plants, many of which he successfully acclimatized in the royal gardens, and this custom, followed by his successors and adopted by the rich, led to the introduction of many fruits and plants previously unknown even to the cultivated Rome. Among these cottons, rice, the sugarcane, the pomegranate, and the peach may be mentioned. But many of our garden vegetables have also come to us from the same source. It may be worth noting that the peach, to which we are in the habit of attributing a Persian origin, was found by the Persians. According to Strabo, in the eastern part of Negroland, where it was cultivated by the Ethiopians at the period of the conquest of Egypt by Cambyses, it does not seem to be native to Negroland, and the presumption is that it may have been introduced into the valley of the Nile from India. Nevertheless, we may accept it as a pleasant fruit of the early intercourse of Egypt with Negroland. Among the vegetables which we owe to the Arab passion for gardening is asparagus. This was introduced somewhat later than the peach by a certain courtier and epicure of the name of Zaria, who came to Andalusia in 821. This Zaria, who, like Tariq, and others, was a freed man, was a celebrated musician. He improved the lute, adding a fifth string to the four, which up to this time had sufficed, and founded a great school of music. He was renowned throughout Spain, enjoyed a public pension, and on one occasion when he came to Cordova, the Sultan himself, to show the respect which he held to be due to talent, rode out to meet him. Zariabs appear to have been a remarkable as well as an extraordinary popular person. He was not only talented but learned. He was an astronomer and geographer. He had a prodigious memory. He was not only, he was, moreover, gifted with so much penetration and wit. He had so deep an acquaintance with the various branches of polite literature. He possessed in so eminent a degree the charms of polite conversation and the talent requisite to entertain an audience, that there never was either before or after him a man of his profession who was more generally beloved and admired. Kings and great people took him for a pattern of manners and education, and his name became forever celebrated among the inhabitants of Andalusia. Zaria, who is worth quoting individually as having been evidently a leader of fashion in the most civilized court of Europe in the early half of the 9th century, appears to have disdained no detail of daily life. Asparagus is not the only dish which he added to the menus of his day. He was fastidious about cooking and invented many good things. He also introduced the fashion of being served on crystal instead of on gold or silver, with other refinements of the table. The manufacture of glass was introduced into Spain by an Arab of the name of Fonas at about this period. Zaria also set the fashion of changing dress for 4 seasons of the year instead of 4 for only 2, as was the custom before his day. The curious in such matters may read in the Arab chronicles that, what was worn, silks and muslins, wadded cloths or weighted cloths, and furs, according to the time of the year. The ladies were also extremely fond of jewels and wore even jeweled shoes, for which they will give as much as 120 pounds a pair. Wow. 1,000 years ago, women, they buy shoes, like they can give as much as what is the value of 120 pounds for shoes. 1,000 years ago, note that, women, shoes, fashion or jewel. Anyway, before this time, the kings of Andalusia, we are told, used to have their clothes washed in water of roses and other garden flowers, the consequence of which was that they never looked quite clean. Zaria taught them a method in which, by adding salt to the mixture, the linen could be made clear and white. The Chronicle gravely recalls that the experiment having been tried, everyone approved of it, and Zaria was much praised for the invention. It was the reputation of the Arabs that they were the cleanest people upon earth. In all that related to their person, dress, beds, and interior of the houses. Indeed, we are told, they carried cleanliness so far that it was not an uncommon thing for a man of the lower class to spend his last coin in soap instead of buying food for his daily consumption, and thus go without his dinner rather than appear in public in dirty clothes. By way of contrast, in habits, we may recall certain Irish earls who, towards the end of the Desmond Rebellion about 1581, are described as sleeping with their ladies and all their servants in a hall so dirty as to be not fit for a hog cot, while the only toilet that the ladies made in the morning was to get up and shake their hairs. Zaria flourished some 7 centuries before the ladies, whose toilet was so simple, it was the contemporary of egg baths and Charlemagne. There's a G in it, but it's a silent G. Charlemagne. Well, the contrast between Arab civilization and the civilization of Northern Europe of that date is sharply accentuated by the fact that while the literature of the Arabs was such as to remain for our instructions to this day, Charlemagne, the greatest monarch of the West, could not write. Spain, under the Arabs, truly deserved, as we have seen its name, as the noble repository of learning. One of the 4 principal things in which Cordova was said to surpass all other cities was the science therein cultivated. It was reputed to be the city of the earth where the greatest number of books was to be found. One of the Umayyad sultans was so fond of books that he is said to have converted Andalusia into a great market whereto the literary productions of every clime were brought immediately for sale. He also collected round him and employed in his own palace the most skillful men of his time in binding, transcribing, and illuminating books. He amassed such literary treasures as no sovereign before or after him, to the knowledge of his biographers, had ever possessed. It is said of him that he was so fond of reading that he preferred the pleasure of perusing his books to all the enjoyment which royalty could afford. He himself wrote a voluminous history of Andalusia. His collection of books founded the great library of Cordova, which remained until the taking of the city by the Berbers in AD 1010. The catalogue alone consisted of 44 volumes. Every wealthy man in Cordova had his own library, to such an extent did this rage for collection increase, says Ibn Said, that any man in a prominent position considered himself obliged to have a library of his own and to spare a trouble or expense in collecting books. Anyway, let's read the last few paragraphs from that chapter. By the way, they're describing the life of the Arabs in Spain, Andalusia, when they took it over. You know. So here it said there were histories, essays, poems. There were treaties. I mean, treaties, right? Upon arithmetic, grammar, poetry, rhetoric, canon, and civil law, jurisprudence, logic. List of distinguished writers have been preserved in biographical dictionaries which have escaped destruction, and it is therefore possible to some extent to reconstruct the intellectual life of the day. It would appear to have been active, charming, polished. The Arabs claimed for their children and their women that they had a natural gift for poetry, narrative, and repartee. They appear to have had a sufficient number of poets to furnish matter for biographies of poets, of which one is mentioned as having been in 10 volumes. The minor arts, as we have seen, were warmly encouraged. Seville, which was the special home of music, had a large export trade in musical instruments, which is sent to Africa. In this town, it was said that every musical instrument was to be obtained. Toledo was the center of steel and metal work. In Cordova, the famous Cordovan leather, of which the skins were imported from Negroland, was worked into many designs and extensively used in beautiful book bindings. All the arts to which elaborate architecture and luxurious domestic life gave rise were, of course, highly developed. Painting appears to have been restricted chiefly to decorative work, but we are repeatedly told that the palaces of southern Spain were filled with works of art. It is interesting to note that in the great days of Mohammedan Spain, Arabian women were not confined, as in the East, to harems, but appeared freely in public and took their share in all the intellectual, literary, and even scientific movements of the day. Women held schools in some of the principal towns. There were women poets, historians, and philosophers, as well as women surgeons and doctors. A national life so varied and active, having a commerce which reached to the confines of the known world, naturally drew material for its consumption from every source with which it was acquainted. Negroland offered to Saracen Spain many of the same sources of supply which our tropical colonies offer to us, and it will presently be seen how deeply the development of Negroland was affected by the high civilization of the peninsula. Now that's chapter 4. So I am going to go to, so that means we are done with chapter, sorry, I'm sorry, that's chapter 3, rather, end of chapter 3. We're going to go to chapter 4, and we're also going to go to chapter 5. Let me see how far is that chapter 5. So that means we're going to do 3 chapters this afternoon before we call it. Yeah, we should be able to do that. Right. So, chapter 4, reading from the Tropical Dependency. Remember, the book were written by Flora Shaw, the woman that gave you the name Nigeria. The former, see, Flora Shaw is also, she's also known as Lady Lugard, okay? As a journalist, who was like almost everywhere. She was in India, she was, then in Africa, in a few other places in Africa, where she met Lugard in India, I think. Then Lugard was transferred to Africa, right? I want to remember the country they took him to. Anyway, from there, I think it was what do you call Zimbabwe? What do we call Zimbabwe? If you don't call them Zimbabwe, Rhodesia. Okay, the person that founded or gave the name Rhodesia to Zimbabwe, his name is Rhodes, something Rhodes. That's his name. So when his time was done, so they brought Lugard. Must be Rhodesia. So they brought Lugard. Was it Rhodesia or the Gambia? I'm sorry, I'm not too sure now. Okay, but either of the two, sure. So that was from where Lugard was then transferred to Nigeria. And upon arriving in Nigeria, he introduced the violence, right? The violence, in fact, he actually fought with the Fulanis, because by then the Fulanis were just trying to consolidate their own power in, in the northern, in Hausa land. So when Lugard came, so Lugard had to make a deal with them, where while he was amalgamating the north and the south protectorates in Nigeria, he had to make a deal with the Fulanis by saying that he was not going to tamper with whatever gain they've made. Like wasn't. In fact, if they are willing to work with him, he was willing to let them enjoy their win and all that. And they agreed. So that was how they introduced a different kind of rules in northern Nigeria and a different kind of rules in southern Nigeria. The idea of a direct rule, indirect rule. So the direct rule is in the south, Lugard, right, appointed different, what do you call it? They brought in different white people to the colonial office, okay, so that they were there working directly, issuing, orders and commands and what have you in the south. Yeah. But in the north, it was an indirect rule. So they had to rule via their emir, established via their emir, via their sultan, and what have you. So it was an arrangement that Lugard had to make with the Fulanis when he got to Nigeria, but not before. They had a serious months of clashes and all that, even though they sort of defeated the Fulanis, right? Unfortunately, they found a common they found a common ground, so to say. The Fulanis, they are not indigenous to Nigeria, and the only way they probably could last, was to kill as many people, indigenous people, as possible, spread fear, so people would have no choice. If you don't want to be killed, just surrender to them. And that's how they believe that they will survive. And that's how they've survived to this day, because the British they have something in common in that regard. So, and that is why we are where we are today. Lugard and Flora Shaw. Let's read this. Okay, chapter 4. The Empire of the Two Shaws. The dynasty of Omeyyades, man, all these names, man. Anyway, lasted nominally in Spain until the year 1031. But the visible decay of his power may be placed about the year 1000. That's the year 1000, 2000, 2021, 2025. So you imagine, you see year 1025. This is year 2025. That's like 1000 years ago, just like for context. So Abdurrahman thought, one of the greatest of the Western caliphs, reigned for 50 years. between the dates of 911 and 961 AD. He was the first to assume the title of Commander of the Faithful in the West, and his reign may be taken as marking the highest epoch of Mohammedan authority in Europe. The Christian nations of the north represented to the Mohammedans of that day nothing more than barbarism, and in levying successful war upon them, Abdurrahman took the palace of the champion of civilization. Every year he renewed his attacks. He carried war by land across the Pyrenees, and his fleets dominated the Mediterranean. In this manner, says his chronicler, the Muslims subdued the country of the Franks beyond utmost limits, reached during the reigns of his predecessors. The Christian nations beyond the Pyrenees extended to him the hand of submission, and their kings sent costly presents to conciliate his favor. Even the kings of Rome, Constantinople, Germany, Sclavonia, and other distant parts sent ambassadors asking for peace and suspension of hostilities, and offering to agree to any conditions which he could dictate. The most elaborate receptions were accorded to these embassies, and it is rather interesting to note, incidentally, in a description of the reception of the embassy from Constantinople, which took place with extraordinary magnificence in the year 949, that amongst other things brought by the ambassadors, there was a letter enclosed in a gold case with a portrait of the Emperor Constantine, admirably executed in stained glass. Abdurrahman moved, it is said, by the consideration that he could not afford to have any hostile power so close to the borders of Spain as Western Africa. Subdued also a great portion of Africa. He thus established the power of the Western Caliphate from the borders of Negroland to the Pyrenees, and this double kingdom was known by the name of Aduate, or the two shores. In the course of all his wars, he suffered but one serious defeat, and he had the surname of the Victorious. Never, it is said, was the Mohammedan Empire more prosperous than during his reign. Commerce and agriculture flourished. The sciences and arts received a new impulse, and the revenue was increased tenfold. It was under the Abdurrahman that cotton manufacture was first established in Europe in the year 930. The Arabs also introduced the art of printing calicos from wooden blocks. Abdurrahman is described as the mildest and most enlightened sovereign that ever ruled. His meekness, his generosity, and his love of justice became proverbial. None of his ancestors surpassed him in courage in the field. He was fond of science and the patron of the learned, with whom he loved to converse, spending those hours that he stole from the arduous labors of the administration in literary meetings, to which all the eminent poets and learned men of his court were admitted. It is an interesting comment on his behalf, on this half century of glory and prosperity, that after Abdurrahman's death, a paper was found in his own handwriting, in which those days that he had spent in happiness were carefully noted down, and on numbering them, they were found to amount to 14. Before the nominal end of the Umayyad dynasty, a usurper, Al-Mansur, called in Barbars and Zenatas, whom he divided into companies according to their tribes and made himself Sultan. Al-Mansur became one of the great caliphs and established a splendid dominion in Western Africa. But the fact that he was a usurper held in power by African tribes introduced a dangerous element of disruption into the body politic of the caliphate in Spain, the Berbers of Africa began to recognize their power. The descendants of the original Berbers, who, with the Arabs, had affected the conquest of Spain, were growing soft with the pleasure and the luxury of a high civilization. The Aruda brothers in Africa had kept their vigor and began to realize the possibility which it opened to them. A great African revolt was organized, the result of which was that Al-Mansur gave first in sovereignty to the Berber chiefs of the Zenata tribes. The result of which was that, sovereignty. So I'll take that again. A great African revolt was organized, the result of which was that Al-Mansur gave first in sovereignty to the Berber chiefs of the Zenata tribes, together with a good bit of Western Africa, including the southern province of what we now call Morocco, side by side with the dominion of the caliphs. Local sovereignties in Africa acquired importance, and the ambitions, thus partially gratified, were not long limited to Africa. Al-Mansur died in 1002, that's 1002. And Arab historians are in practical agreement that from this time, the Mohammedan Empire in Spain began to show signs of decay. Perpetual claimants of the throne of the caliphs employed African troops in Spain. Between 1020 and 1030, the whole of Andalusia had submitted with revolts and civil wars to the Berbers. It became the habit of the reigning caliph to employ a black bodyguard drawn from Negroland. And instead of maintaining the old attitude of united hostility to the Christians on their northern borders, each faction in turn called in Christian help. It was not long before the Christian armies dominated the situation. The limits of the Arab Empire became narrower and the power of the caliphs was broken. Cordova, Granada, Malaga, Seville became separate principalities. Here is a view of the situation as presented by an Arab historian of the 16th century, in quotes. In Africa, as well as in Andalusia, the possessions of the Umayyad were broken up into petty provinces, thus giving an opportunity to the cruel enemy of God to attack in detail the divided Muslims and to expel them at last from those countries which they had so long held in their power. Alfonso VI took Toledo in 1081. In the following year, Al-Mu'tamid, the Arab king of Seville, refused to pay him tribute, and Alfonso swore to drive the Arabs into the sea at Gibraltar. In this extremity, Al-Mu'tamid looked across the straits for help, and Africa once more intervened directly in the affairs of Spain. To understand the position which had been reached in Africa, it is necessary to go back for a few years. It has been mentioned that of the two main roads by which communication between Negroland and Northern Africa was maintained, one lay across the Western Desert in a direction almost due south of the territory now known as Morocco. The consequence of many wars in Northern Africa had been to force down certain Berber tribes upon the western confines of Negroland. From time immemorial, says Ibn Khaldun, the Molet Femin, that's the name of, or wearers of the veil, had been in the sandy desert. As brave as they were wild, they had never bowed under a foreign yoke. Having increased their numbers in the vast plains of the desert, they formed several tribes: the Godala, the Lemtuna, the Mesomfa, the Ausila, the Tuareg, the Zegua, and the Lanta. These people were all brothers of the Senaja, who lived between the Atlantic and is in the western half of the northern Africa. The Lemtuna were already a powerful nation obeying hereditary kings when the Umayyad dynasty reigned in Spain. And the western portion of the desert over which they ruled was known as the Desert Empire. At that time, also, the Negro nations of the West were very powerful. But at a later period, after the Lemtunas had subdued the lesser tribes, the western kingdom of the Negroes began to decay. The Lemtuna made war upon them and forced them partially to accept Islam. Under Sultan, a Lemtuna king who died in the year 837, the Desert Empire reached its height. 20 Negro kings paid tribute to him. Excuse me. It is said of his kingdom that the climate was so healthy that men commonly reached it in the age of 80. The sons and successors of Sultan reigned successfully until year 918 AD, when the dynasty was overthrown by the Senaja. After this, there was confusion mixed with conquest for about 120 years. Until there came to the throne a Senaja ruler of the name of Yahaya, under whom there took place a union of the tribes, which resulted in the foundation of the Empire of Morocco. In 1048, Yahaya made the pilgrimage to Mecca and brought back with him for the instruction of his people a religious teacher, Ibn Yassin. The United Tribes had never wholly abandoned the nomad habits of their ancestors. They were a hardy, active people who had kept the abstemious customs of the desert. Their principal wealth consisted in their flocks. They were among those of whom it was said that many of them passed their lives without ever seeing bread. They had long since embraced Islam, but they had apparently strayed from the true path, and the reformation preached by Ibn Yassin was stern. Severe penalties were imposed on wrongdoing. The man who told a lie was beaten with 80 strokes. The man who drank wine was beaten with 80 strokes. Serious offenses were more heavily punished, and every stranger who joined the sect was required to forfeit 1/3 of his property by way of redemption for any injustice by which he might have acquired the rest. The pressure of these doctrines in application produced a revolt. Ibn Yassin, with a few of his followers, withdrew to an island in the Senegal, the river which formed the southern frontier of the Desert Kingdom. Here, he practiced in rigid seclusion all he taught. The fame of his doctrine spread through the West, and thousands flocked to him, till at last, seeing the number of his followers daily increase, he declared to them that it was not enough to accept the truth themselves. They must also constrain the world to accept it. He gave to his disciples the name Morabites, the name of Morabites, or champions of the earth. Rather, champions of the faith, champions of the faith. Afterwards known as Almoravids, and proceeded to preach a holy war, jihad, to maintain the truth. In quote, he said, to maintain the truth, to repress injustice, and to abolish all taxes not based on law, was the formula of faith with which this religious movement started from the extreme south of the then known Western world. The Emir Yahya assumed command, and under his leadership, the Almoravids began that triumphant march to the north, which was to end only on the throne of Spain. Yahya died in 1056 after a successful campaign which established his power in southwestern Morocco. He was succeeded by his brother, Abu Bakr, who led the Almoravids to further conquest. Their dominion spread across the Atlas Mountains to the sea, and they subdued all the territory to the western coast. In 1061, the dissensions breaking out amongst the tribes in the south, Abu Bakr returned to his desert kingdom, leaving his cousin Yusuf Tachefin in command in the north. This proved to be a final division. Abu Bakr succeeded in reconciling his unruly tribes and to give an outlet to their energies, he led them to the conquest of Negroland, the northern border of which he overran for a distance of 90 days march from his own territory. This should have carried him to the Hausa states, but he returned no more to take command in the north. In the year 1062, Yusuf laid the foundation of the town of Morocco with his own hands, and not long afterwards declared the independence of the northern kingdom of which it was to become the capital. Abu Bakr acquiesced, and Yusuf left to himself, continued the conquest of northwestern Africa. By the year 1082, he had long been the supreme ruler of that portion of the world. His court had begun to attract the learning and civilization which civil war was driving out of Spain. And we are told that it was filled with Arabs from the frontier towns which had submitted to Alfonso. These men, with tears in their eyes and sorrow in their hearts, had come to Yusuf to implore his protection. It was to this court and to this man that Al-Mutamed of Seville came in 1083 to ask for help against the Christians. Yusuf is described as a wise and shrewd man, neither too prompt in his determinations nor too slow in carrying them into effect. He had passed the greater part of his life in his native desert, exposed to hunger and privation, and had no taste for a life of pleasure. It is expressly said of him that he did not speak Arabic. When, therefore, he consented to cross over to Spain and in the course of time drove back the Christians and established once more a supreme sultan upon the throne of Andalusia, his conquest and the dynasty which he founded must be regarded as an African conquest and an African dynasty. The Almoravids ruling in Spain were identically the same race as that which, moving from the west, imposed Islam on the races of Negroland and established kingdoms, of which we shall presently hear along the courses of the Niger and the Senegal. It is stated that when Yusuf crossed to Spain, there was no tribe of the Western Desert that was not represented in his army. And it was the first time that the people of Spain had ever seen camels used for the purpose of mounting cavalry. Forming part of the army which fought at Zalaka in 1086, there were also some thousands of black armed with Indian swords and short spears and shields covered with hippopotamus hide. This battle drove the Christian forces out of southern Spain and laid the foundation of Yusuf's Spanish Empire. When after fighting it, Yusuf marched to Seville, the comfort and luxury of that town, far from raising in his mind the admiration and astonishment that might have been expected, impressed him with very different sentiments. His counselors and courtiers pointed out to him the advantages which power conferred in a civilized country. It strikes me, he replied, that this man, meaning the king of Seville, is throwing away the power which has been placed in his hands. Instead of giving his attention to the good administration and defense of his kingdom, he thinks of nothing else than satisfying the cravings of his passion. Of course, not long afterwards, when Yusuf had returned to Africa, his generals informed him that the whole of the fighting against the Christians was left to them, while the kings of Andalusia remained sunk in pleasure and sloth. They asked for his instructions and were ordered to conquer the kings of Andalusia. and to appoint every city or town as it fell into their power, a governor from among the officers of Yusuf's army. Right, so town after town fell to the army of Almoravids, till Seville itself was taken, and the king sent a prisoner into Africa, where he died in 1095. Yusuf died in 1106. His son succeeded to the Sultanate of North Africa and Spain, and the Almoravid dynasty continued to reign with a double court, one in Africa and one in Spain. The Sultan residing alternately in either until the African dominion was overthrown in 1142, and the Spanish dominion 3 years later in 1145. The last Almoravid sovereign of Africa and Spain was, according to Ibn Khaldun, executed in the presence of the Almohad conqueror in 1147. During the whole of this period, as under the dynasty of Umayyads, intercourse between Spain and Negroland was freely maintained. So we have done the chapter 4. So I'm going to go into chapter 5 now. So first I'll take a break, and then when I come back, right, I will continue. I'm looking for something to help me do my break. Pardon me. Just something in between.
70 years old man. Jesus is Lord. Jesus. 70 years old man. Jesus is Lord. Jesus.
Anyway, thank you very much. I decided to at least something this last. Thank you so much for listening, all right? So let's wrap it up. Chapter 5. So chapter 5 has, let's see, it's got it's got 10 pages. So I'm going to read through it like quickly. Now, Africa rule in Spain. Africa rule in Spain. Although the Almoravids, on their first entrance into Spain, came as reformers from the desert, preaching a stern doctrine of abnegation, they yielded rapidly to the seduction of Spanish luxury, and in little more than half a century, they are spoken of by Arab historians as having become soft and effeminate, like their predecessors. The probability is that the body of the Moors in Spain remained what they had been before the Almoravid invasion, and the course of history was not altered, but only delayed by the African conquest. In the same spirit of religious reform, in the same spirit of religious reform, which had steered the founder of Almoravid sect, the Mahdi, arose in the early part of the 20th century in the northern provinces of Ifriqiya. Ifriqiya is Africa, by the way, and preached a doctrine so stringent that it excited a revolt among the populace and was obliged to fly from the anger of the Sultan. He appeared first in Bugia in 1118 and preached his eccentric reforms in Telemcan, Fez, Mequins, and Morocco. Everywhere he excited the anger of the people, and towards 1121, he withdrew into the desert, where gradually disciples began to join him in great numbers. The authorities persecuted him here also, and he then called upon the Mesmudian Barbars to rally to his cause, to defend his person, and to declare a holy war in defense of the doctrine of the unity of God. He declared himself to be the Mahdi, and he gave to his follower the title of Almohads, or Unitarians. He entrenched himself in the mountain of Timelel, in the southern fastnesses of the Atlas chain, and this spot remained the stronghold of the sect until their final extinction as a political power about 100 years later. The original Mahdi died in 1128, but this event had little effect upon the sect. In 1130, a war began between the Almohads and the Almoravids in Africa, which ended in 1147 by the capture of Morocco and the execution of the reigning Almoravid sovereign. No sooner was the province of Morocco subdued than the Almohads crossed into Spain, and after a determined contest with the Christian armies, who were only with the greatest difficulty prevented from taking Cordova, Muslim Spain swore fealty in 1150 to the Almohads. Thus, for a second time, a purely African dynasty reigned upon the most civilized throne of Europe. This same Almohad conqueror reconstructed the Moorish fleet and added to it no less than 460 vessels. His reign, which lasted until 1163, was a period of constant war, during which he was compelled to put out all his strength against the Christians. He succeeded in holding his own with difficulty, and his successor united all the tribes of North Africa in a holy war against the infidels of Spain. It's curious to read in the Arab Chronicle the history of the Crusades told from the other side. It will be remembered that the famous Saladin took Jerusalem in 1187. In 1189, this Caliph of the Eastern Arabs appealed to the reigning Almohad Caliph of the West, El-Mansur, to assist with his maritime forces in the sieges of Acre, Tyre, and Tripoli. And according to one historian, 180 ships sent by the African Sultan prevented the Christians from landing in Syria. Under the great Almohad sovereigns, the glory of the Arabs in Spain was well maintained. Monuments of their civil activities remain in the castle of Gibraltar, which they built in 1160, and the great mosque of Seville, which was begun in 1183. The Giralda or Tower of Seville, not alas, now perhaps to be spoken of as existing, was built as an observatory under the superintendence of the mathematician Geber in 1196. The Almoravids had fixed their Spanish court at Seville. The Almohades imported to their African court in Morocco workmen from all parts of Spain. Ibn Said described Morocco in the 13th century as the Baghdad of the West, and says that it was never so prosperous as under the early Almohades. Both dynasties had two courts, one in Africa and one in Spain. Thus, whatever was the prosperity or greatness of one part of their empire, it was shared by the other. And under the Almohades, there was a shifting towards the African center. A good deal of jealousy seems to have existed between the natives of the two shores as to the merit of their respective territories. A certain distinguished citizen of Tangier, Abu Yahya, arguing on one occasion with the Sheikh Ash-Shakandi of Cordova, who flourished under the later Almohades and died in 1231, on the advantages of their respective countries, provoked Ash-Shakandi to say, quote, "Were it not for Andalusia, Africa, thy country would never have been known." Do you really mean, replied the African, to say that excellency and power resides anywhere in such degree as amongst us? Prove it. The Caliph, who was listening to the dispute, interposed. He said that it was too serious to be decided by extempore writing. Hence, the celebrated epistle of Ash-Shakandi, written under the last of the Almohades, to which we are indebted for a great deal of contemporary information. It states the case for the civilization of Spain, half of the empire. Unfortunately, the counterstatement of the Abu Yahya maintaining the claims of the African half has not been preserved. He pretends to make Africa superior to Andalusia, exclaimed Ash-Shakandi in derision of his opponents. It is as much as to say that the left hand is better than the right, and that night is lighter than day. No claim is allowed to be based on the fact that the Sultan of the day kept their chief court in Africa. We too, says Ash-Shakandi, have had our sultans, and he speaks of the Umayyads as sultans who succeeded each other as pearls in a necklace united by the thread. The breakup of their empire was as the cutting of the string, as the Umayyads are the object of his panegyric. So the African South is disdain. Let's go to chapter. Right. So it proceeds to this description of Spain itself, its principal towns, monuments. Much that was said of Cordova in a previous chapter was taken from this epistle. Though himself a native of Cordova, he says of Seville, where the later court of the Almoravids and Almohades was fixed. I don't know why I'm afraid of Almohades, Almoravids, and stuff, by the way. I can jump them, by the way. I can. Let me go to somewhere else. So here is another paragraph. Other Spanish towns, Granada, with its magnificent chestnut trees, Toledo, Valencia, rich in trade and noted for the paper manufactories, of Xatina in its neighborhood. Jaén, so famous for its silk manufacture. Just describing Spain. Sorry, guys. That story of the state of affairs which it illustrates belong, however, to another period. The reign of the Almohad El-Mazur, which lasted till 1214, marks the greatest period of Almohad
prosperity. It was during this reign in the year 1195 that the three Christian kings of Aragon, Castile, and Leon were overthrown in the celebrated Battle of Alacos, at which it was said that the loss of the Christians amounted to 146,000 men. Anyway, so that was in Granada. Thus began in the 12th century, after a long period of African domination in Spain, a reaction of Europe upon Africa, which has continued to the present day. This expulsion of the Christians from Granada may be taken as the first of the great religious expulsions for which Spain became famous in later years. It is just to remember that the system was initiated by the Moors, and it is perhaps worth noting that the celebrated Averroes, one of the most famous among the many names associated with the Enlightenment which Arab civilization spread through the dark ages of medieval Europe, was so warm an advocate of the measure that he took the trouble to cross from the Spain court to the court of Morocco for the purpose of urging his views upon the Sultan. He appears to have spent a considerable part of his life at the court of Morocco, which was at that time a center of learning. He died there in 1198, and in recording his death, Morocco is mentioned as the capital of Sudan. The mere existence of this geographical expression used has been said by the Arabs to signify the two kingdoms of Spain and Africa shows how very closely the interest of two countries had become bound together. In connection with the residence of the learned Averroes at the court of El Mazur in Africa, it may be worth mentioning that the praises of the same sovereign were sung in his court at Seville by the learned and celebrated poet, a black of Sudan, Abu Ishaq Ibrahim al-Kanemi. The circumstance, though slight, is interesting as serving to show that at the end of the 12th century, Negroland contributed not only its commercial wares, but also its quota of art to the shores, to the stores of Europe. So from the beginning of the 13th century onward, the decay of the Muslim power in Spain is marked. The Christian powers made constant and successful onslaught upon the Almohad possessions. Town after town of importance fell into their hands. They were assisted by internal divisions among the Muslims. In 1230, after nearly a century of brilliant rule, the Almohad dynasty was brought to an end by the deposition of the reigning sovereign. The Muslim portion of the continent declared itself independent under Ibn Hud, also a leader of African origin. Valencia fell into Christian hands in 1238, Cordova 1239, Seville 1260. A little later, the whole of the Muslim population was driven to the coast between Ronda in the west and Almeria in the east. In Africa, the province of Ifriqiya, which stretched at one period from the confines of Egypt to those of Morocco, at the same time declared itself independent under a sultan of the outside dynasty. In 1269, the Maronites possessed themselves of the throne of Morocco and its surrounding provinces and fixed their capital at Fez, like Fez cap. When nothing was left to the Almohads but Tafilet and a small part of Ifriqiya, they returned to their stronghold of Timehel, to maintain for a few years only a phantom caliph, Ishaq, last of his race, who, when the successful siege of Tafilet in 1274 had given all that remained of Moroccan soil to the Maronites, was brought before the ruling sovereign of that dynasty and executed. It is interesting to note that at this siege of Tafilet, which put an end to even such empty pretense has still remained of the dual empire of Spain and Africa. Mention is made of the use of firearms or fire engines, which threw out iron gravel. The shot, it is said, was forced from the piece by means of a burning powder, of which the singular properties work effects that rival the power of the creator as the God. Right, so that's chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5 now covered. So thank you so much for listening. I'm going to see you later this evening. We are going to continue this tomorrow. It's always going to be until we read to that substantial part that we don't really have to finish it. So right now, the book itself has, the book actually have, let's see, how many pages? 500 pages. And where are we? We are still at page 66. So we still have like over 400 pages to go. That is if we read everything. So join me again tomorrow, same time, from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m., right? Then join me later as well tonight for the normal prime time on Maiyegun's Diary Politico. Good afternoon.
Maiyegun làwa mọ̀ làmọ̀ tó dòdòdò. Maiyegun Diary, Maiyegun number 1. Maiyegun làwa mọ̀ làmọ̀ tó dòdòdò. Maiyegun Diary, Maiyegun number 1. Maiyegun ti dé o, ọ̀rẹ́ ará ìlú. Maiyegun Diary, Maiyegun number 1. Lórí Facebook, lórí YouTube. Maiyegun Diary, Maiyegun number 1. Gbogbo bó ṣe ń lọ ni Maiyegun já wa sí. Maiyegun Diary, Maiyegun number 1. Àṣírí ọ̀jẹ̀lú kì í bò níbẹ̀ o. Maiyegun Diary, Maiyegun number 1. Bó bá ṣe eré àní Maiyegun máa wí. Maiyegun Diary, Maiyegun number 1. Ó sì tún ṣe eré wàá gbọ́ níbẹ̀ o. Maiyegun Diary, Maiyegun number 1. Maiyegun Diary, Diary Politico. Maiyegun Diary, Maiyegun number 1. Godfatherism kò sí lọ́rọ̀ Maiyegun. Maiyegun Diary, Maiyegun number 1. Ẹ farabalẹ̀ sẹ́ o kẹgọ́rọ̀ lẹ́nu o. Maiyegun Diary, Maiyegun number 1. Àní Maiyegun làwa mọ̀ tó dòdòdò. Maiyegun Diary, Maiyegun number 1. Àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì. Maiyegun ti dé. Maiyegun ti dé. Ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀sùn ràkì. Maiyegun ti dé. Àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì. Maiyegun ti dé. Lórí Facebook. Maiyegun ti dé. Àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì. Maiyegun ti dé. Lórí YouTube. Maiyegun ti dé. Àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì. Maiyegun ti dé. Bọ́ bàbá gbé wúrẹ́. Maiyegun máa wí. Àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì. Maiyegun ti dé. Ijó ìgbádìyẹ. Maiyegun máa wí. Àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì. Maiyegun ti dé. Bí pẹ̀sìdó bá rúfin o. Maiyegun máa wí. Àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.